There's only a few things you can consume during a fast, right? You can consume coffee, you can consume tea, some beverages, pretty much that's it, right? But if you open up the entire Pandora's box of different teas, you realize there's hundreds and thousands of different teas, right? Well, what teas are best for fasting for specific use cases? Now, some of the stuff we're talking about can be pretty profound, but there's also uses for teas during your eating period too that can help you out with digestion, assimilation of nutrients, things like that. So without further ado, let's jump right in. After today's video, I popped a link down below for Timeline Nutrition. If you're interested in longevity science, which if you're watching a fasting video, you probably are, you might be curious to see what Timeline Nutrition is doing. They've leveraged the power of something that's called urolithin A. So it's a compound that is derived from pomegranates, but only a small percentage of people can actually manufacture this compound from pomegranate. But it triggers something called mitophagy. Okay, mitophagy is autophagy at a mitochondrial level. Now it sounds very esoteric, and it kind of is, but it's a little bit of this fringe research that's fascinating. Now Timeline Nutrition and MitoPure have conducted research that's been published in JAMA surrounding this. Very interesting stuff. So anyhow, you could add it to yogurt in a berry powder form. You can add it to water. You can have it in a capsule form. They have a protein shake version of it. Very interesting stuff if you're interested in autophagy and mitochondrial health. So that link is down below. It saves you 10% off whatever you want to get from them as well. But it's definitely worth investigating if you're just kind of on the cutting edge of sort of the biohacking world. The first tea that really needs no introduction, but it does need to be talked about, is going to be simple green tea. Now you have different forms of green tea. You have matcha, you have traditional, you have, whatever. For all intents and purposes, we're just gonna say blanket green tea. The benefits of green tea are not what people think they are. Yes, there's the fat loss side, okay? As far as documented research, and I talked to Alan Aragon about this, who, if you know who he is, he's about as stingy as they can be when it comes down to what burns fat. And he was like caffeine and EGCG, that's about it. EGCG is the catechin in green tea. So that is my number one tea during a fasting period, flat out, okay? I don't have it after I break my fast, I have it during my fast. Fatty acid oxidation benefits, and then we're also getting the antioxidant benefits that are just enough to not discredit the effects of a fast. Now, additionally, there's some Japanese research that demonstrates that the more green tea you consume, the better they were off, like psychologically. And it might have something to do with the theanine, it might have something to do with the antioxidants in the brain. The mechanism is still a little bit unknown. But if you're stressed out and you just need something to calm you down, it seems counterintuitive because of the caffeine in green tea, but it's not that way. The theanine seems to counteract it, and the antioxidants seem to counteract a little bit. So that's the first one, the best one. The next tea you want to consider consuming is going to be one that you'd consider towards the end of a fast, right before you break your fast. Now, I've talked about this in other videos, and that's going to be more of a cinnamon type tea. So some kind of herbal tea with cinnamon, or an herbal tea with no caffeine that you maybe just add cinnamon into. The reason that I suggest this is there is some somewhat fringe but still solid research surrounding cinnamon and cortisol, but more so cinnamon and its effect as an insulin mimicker. What that means is it can mimic insulin and potentially reduce glucose. Now, the reason that I say this is towards the end of a fast, you end up a little bit higher on the cortisol scale. What that means is you're at the end of a fast, you're kind of stressed out from the fast, at least physiologically, maybe not mentally, and this means that cortisol levels are high. Right when you break your fast, you're going to be spiking insulin, okay? Insulin and cortisol should not really go hand in hand. Nothing wrong with cortisol unless it's chronic. So when you're stressed, you don't want to have a big spike in insulin. So what I recommend is having some herbal tea that has cinnamon in it prior to breaking your fast, because it can kind of lessen the insulin response a little bit more as an insulin mimicker. So then you're not having to have as much of this big spike. So that's a good recommendation there. Now, a tea that you might want to have either the beginning of your fast or after you break your fast is going to be ginger. Now, the World Journal of Gastroenterology had published a paper demonstrating that ginger could actually speed up digestion time. Now, if you actually get down to the numbers, it was 12.3 minutes for half emptying in the gut versus 16.1 minutes for half emptying in the gut. Compare ginger to placebo. So having a little bit of ginger tea right when you break your fast or during your eating period might help you digest fast enough. One of the biggest problems that we face is getting adequate nutrition and adequate calories during our eating period. If you're fasting for a long period of time, or maybe you're doing 1 meal a day or 2 meals a day, that's a pretty small window of time. And you actually might get full before you ever have the opportunity to really get adequate nutrition in. If we can speed up gastric emptying by a fourth or a fifth, that is enough to really squeeze in another quarter or fifth amount of food, calories, nutrition, right? Not to mention, if you end up with indigestion, you might be able to alleviate that. In fact, most bodies of research have indicated that indigestion is typically caused by delayed gastric emptying, an inability to digest swiftly enough. And the European Journal of Gastroenterology echoed the World Journal of Gastroenterology when it came down to the research surrounding ginger. So we know ginger is good for the gut. We've seen it before. The boxes of tea literally say for digestive support. So just listen to that. Have it during your eating period so you can get a little more food in. What about black tea? When can black tea come into equation? Black tea is interesting because the tannins in black tea are really powerful amylase inhibitors. So what that means is it can slow down carbohydrate digestion. So it would make sense to have it during your eating period, but the problem is black tea is pretty high in caffeine. So if you're doing standard intermittent fasting, where you would have your post-fasting meal at 2 p.m., 3 p.m., something like that, that's too late in the day to really have black tea. It's really not the best. But in case you haven't heard, there's something called early time restricted feeding. Okay, early time restricted feeding is where you are fasting through the afternoon and evening and you're eating in the morning hour. So in that case, it might work really well to have black tea in the morning during your eating period. You could also have green tea too, in addition to that. But the black tea with the tannins could potentially limit the absorption of the carbohydrates, controlling the glycemic impact a little bit more. So controlling that spike. So you're having less potential risk of insulin resistance, less potential risk of hyperglycemia, and able to control that. So that's a great use case for black tea. But here's the other situation. If you're doing ETRF or even regular fasting, you might find that your sleep becomes disrupted. So what can you sip on at night that's gonna help you out? When you look at the data, you see that valerian root is interesting and somewhat powerful, but I've even seen some data on valerian root actually disrupting sleep after the first few hours. And you don't wanna just drink alcohol to put yourself to sleep because that can really mess up your sleep cycles. So it kind of leaves us with a couple of options. We have passion flower tea, which is a total herbal route. That's the route that I typically go. I like how passion flower tea makes me feel. It's mild, it helps my sleep onset, and it seems to carry me through sleep pretty well. The other route is chamomile. Now, chamomile is very cool because it works. It binds to a benzodiazepine receptor. So it acts in the brain similar to, an anti-anxiety drug would. So it has a sedative-like effect. So if you've had a busy day and you've got a lot on your mind and you're stressed out, that would be a great place for chamomile to come into play. I exercise some caution with chamomile because sometimes I feel my brain is a little fuzzy the next day. I don't feel 100%. But if I'm going into a weekend, I've had a stressful week, I've got stuff on my mind, it's tax season or whatever, I don't mind having that sedative-like effect and feeling a little groggy in the morning at the expense of getting good sleep. But passion flower is usually what I'd lean to. And both of these are okay to have either during your fasting period at night or during your eating period at night. And realistically, you can consume these throughout the entire day. And I'll give you a couple of hot tips too. I would recommend utilizing stevia for these. Sometimes monk fruit, although I love it, it does have an insulinogenic effect in some people. If you monitor your glucose, pay attention to that. It might help you understand. If you have monk fruit and your glucose drops really quick, you might be getting somewhat of an insulinogenic effect from monk fruit. Stevia does not seem to do that as much. Or you could just have it straight up with no sweetener, and that's probably the best case. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel. I'll see you tomorrow.